It has traversed the centuries. It is called the Book of Books. The Bible is the greatest bestseller of all time.
It's certainly the most famous, the most sold, the most read, the most brilliant book. It's an extraordinary book.
Known as the Old Testament, the first opus of the Bible is the foundation of the Jewish religion, but also of the two other great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. However, the Old Testament has a strange peculiarity. We don't know its authors.
The problem is we don't know the names of the people who wrote the Bible. They didn't sign their text.
Who wrote the Bible? During which epoch? Under which circumstances? And with what objective? Nothing could allow us to answer these questions until an extraordinary discovery came along to change everything. That of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest biblical manuscripts known to date. Some are over 2,300 years old.
Often the Dead Sea Scrolls are termed the most important archaeological find for our region in the 20th century, and it'll probably be true of the 21st century as well.
Are these manuscripts the original text of the Bible? Could they reveal the identity of its authors to us? This is what experts around the world seek to find out using the most modern techniques.
On the whole, I think the answers lie in the sciences.
Multispectral imaging, DNA research, artificial intelligence. Thanks to these technologies, researchers are trying to unveil one of the greatest mysteries in history. Who wrote the Bible? Gutenberg had not chosen it at random. By making the Bible the first printed book in history, the famous inventor of the printing press was already creating a bestseller in the 15th century. At the time, the question of the authors of the text was not debated. Religious authorities claimed that God himself dictated the scriptures to a few prophets, starting with Moses for the most famous part of the Bible, the Pentateuch.
When we speak of the Bible, we speak primarily of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch means 5 scrolls. There are 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 books have been universally accepted by all movements of Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam. And these books were called the Torah, the teachings, or law, and they were attributed to Moses. And it is he who, in the Jewish and Christian tradition, is the author of the Pentateuch.
But from the 17th century, a more critical approach to the Holy Bible calls this dogma into question. It is the philosopher Spinoza, who in 1670 is one of the first to wonder who wrote the Bible by noting inconsistencies in the text.
Spinoza's argument is very simple. That is to say that Moses could not write the account of his own death. That's the main element. And most of the Torah talks about Moses in the third person singular. So we have a number of literary clues that show that ultimately Moses could not write about his own death.
In most books, we talk about the protagonists in the third person. There may be a book, Nehemiah, where Nehemiah speaks of himself in the first person, but it is almost the exception that proves the rule. In other words, when we study the Bible itself, we realize that the Bible does not claim any author.
But how do you look for the authors of a text of which only successive copies are known, the oldest going back to the early Middle Ages? The task seems impossible until an incredible archaeological discovery occurs. A discovery that will turn everything upside down. It took place in the West Bank, in Qumran, in the Judean desert. On the shores of the Dead Sea, rise rocky cliffs, pierced by numerous caves. It is in these caves, in the heart of this impressive desert, that in 1947, strange manuscripts resurface.
The legend says that two Bedouins were walking in 1947 in the Judean desert with their goats. One of the Bedouins lost his goat, which entered a cave. He throws a stone to make the goat move or bring it out of the hole. And then he hears the sound of broken pottery. He goes down into the cave and he finds one of the famous jars of Qumran with a number of manuscripts in it.
And so they took the scrolls, they thought they were just leather. They took it to a cobbler in Bethlehem, and the cobbler, who was also an antique dealer, realized what he had in hand, sent them back to the cave to get some more.
Thus begins a veritable treasure hunt. Archaeologists and Bedouins, nomadic desert-dwelling people, explore all the caves in the region. It is a French archaeologist, Roland Devaux, who directs the excavation site. This Dominican monk then heads the French Biblical and Archaeological School in Jerusalem, an institution which defends an interpretation of the Bible with an archaeological perspective.
So a team headed by Père Devaux from the École Biblique and the head of the Department of Antiquities of Jordan got together. They came to the area, they surveyed the area, they found Cave 1, and from the tens of caves that they surveyed, 11 yielded thousands and thousands of scroll fragments that today we know belong to about 1,000 manuscripts.
In 10 years, 12 caves are carefully combed through. We discover 87,000 fragments, forming 970 manuscripts. They are kept in jars or placed on the ground. Most are written on parchments, and some on papyrus. The majority is in Hebrew, another part in Aramaic, and the rest in Greek. Some of the best preserved scrolls are very quickly identified as Old Testament texts. Are these manuscripts the source text, so sought after for centuries? Could they reveal the identity of its authors to us? The investigation has only just begun. The manuscripts must first be dated. And luckily, a brand new dating method has just been invented in the United States: carbon-14 dating.
At that time, a chemist realized that by counting the number of carbon-14 particles present in organic tissues, we could date these organic tissues. And so we thought, could we test this new method on the Dead Sea Scrolls? So that's a problem, because you have to take a sample, and that means you're going to destroy a piece of the parchment. No one wants that, but fortunately, some of these parchments were wrapped in linen, and we thought that instead of dating the parchment itself, we would date the linen. We sent it to Chicago. The tests were done, and bingo, the manuscripts date from antiquity.
We date them from 300 BC for the oldest to the 1st century AD, so we spread them over 4 centuries of writing in Qumran.
The oldest manuscript that we had of all the Jewish scriptures is dated to the 8th or 11th century AD, the Aleppo Codex and the so-called Leningrad-St. Petersburg Codex. Then, we suddenly leapt back 10 centuries, or even 11 or 12 centuries.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are therefore the oldest known Bible texts. But before making them speak, this giant puzzle must be put together. Classifying, collecting, and translating texts, with only a magnifying glass and good lighting as tools. A colossal labor.
Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in disastrous condition. They are small fragments, crumbs, and if we only had that, we would have a hard time understanding what a biblical scroll might look like in antiquity. Fortunately, some of these manuscripts have been well preserved. This is the case with the Great Scroll of Isaiah. It is complete. It is over 7 meters long, and it is the only scroll that preserves a book of the Bible in its entirety.
To shelter this treasure, a casement has been specially built in Jerusalem. A vast white dome, which recalls the shape of the lid of the Qumran jars. It is called the Sanctuary of the Book. Built in the 1960s, it brings together the best preserved Dead Sea manuscripts. Starting with the crowning jewel, the Isaiah scroll. It is made up of 17 sheets of leather, measuring almost 23 feet long. Almost all of the 66 chapters of the book of the prophet Isaiah can be read here in Hebrew. It is in this text that the end of the kingdom of Israel is told, and then the return of the Jewish people from exile. It dates from around 100 BC. It is therefore, at present, the oldest complete copy of one of the books of the Old Testament. As for the thousands of fragments, we will have to wait half a century to finally know which manuscripts they correspond to. 50 years during which the world holds its breath and begins to doubt.
Therefore, there were all kinds of conspiracy theories. Why aren't these scrolls published? Now, the truth is that they are very, very vulnerable. They're very, very problematic.
The fragments suffered for 2,000 years. They remained in these caves for the most part on the ground. Some were eaten by rats. There were also bats in there, so a number of fragments are particularly unreadable to the naked eye. The problem was often the tiny bits and pieces. Sometimes you had fragments where there were 2, 3 letters that weren't always easy to attribute to this or that book, to put together with other fragments.
So it took years and years to classify all of these fragments. It was a gigantic task. And basically, on our scale, it seems long, but on the scale of research, it's nothing.
Today, most of Qumran's manuscripts are finally published. Each fragment has been deciphered, transcribed, translated, and is now accessible on a large digital library.
This discovery is thought to be the most important discovery of the 20th century, and because they include all of the books of the Bible, except for the book of Esther, they're very, very important both to the Jewish world and to the Christian world, or to the monotheistic world on the whole. In these scrolls, we see scrolls that are identical to the canonized Bible that we know today. We see scrolls that are different. We see apocrypha, scrolls that did not go into the canonization of the Bible, and therefore their importance.
But at this stage, these manuscripts pose more questions than they answer. Are they the original texts of the Bible? Who deposited them in the caves and why? Could it have been the authors of the Old Testament? A first clue will put archaeologists on the trail of a mysterious Jewish community from antiquity. Among the texts found, about 100 depict the rites and beliefs of a religious community. One of them, which is called the Rules of the Community, even describes their way of life quite precisely.
The scrolls themselves evoke the community of Qumran with the rules of the community, which explain the rule of life, their daily life, the procedure for joining the community, and for someone who is a new disciple who will have maybe 3 years to prove himself.
The researchers of the time make the connection with ancient texts, which evoke a very pious Jewish school of thought, the Essenes. It existed for 300 years, between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD.
We already knew the Essenes from the historians of antiquity, Flavius Josephus, Pliny, and in particular the description that Pliny gives of the Essenes and the location of the Essenes, which he situates quite precisely at the site of Qumran.
Did the Essenes really live in the Qumran desert? Did they place these manuscripts in the caves? Could they be the authors? An archaeological site located only some 300 feet from several caves puts scientists on a promising track.
These ruins of Qumran, which were well known, but which were regarded as having great importance, suddenly became one of the main sites of debate in contemporary archaeology.
It was also excavated by Roland de Vaux, the Dominican monk, who very quickly established a link between the ruins of the site and the caves of Qumran.
The quantity of convergences is enormous. For example, sandal nails. Sandal nails have been found that go from the buildings to the caves and from the caves back to the buildings.
Some caves are very close to the site, so inevitably there is a link between the two. But also the ceramic found in the caves is similar to the ceramic found on the site. So we have factual links between the caves and the site.
The cylindrical jars with lids have indeed been discovered in the caves, but also in the ruins. Archaeologists also unearth many clues that lead them to a community habitat occupied by a group of Essenes.
We looked for a scriptorium, a room that would have been the place where the scribes spent their days copying the manuscripts. So there is indeed a fairly long room with a very, very long table. And we see that here we can unroll several meters of parchment on this table. So this is a scriptorium. We also looked for inkwells because if there were scribes, they would have also needed a pen and an inkwell. We found small jars that may have contained ink, and so we say to ourselves, well, that's it, we discovered inkwells.
Yes, we have the clue of a certain number of inkwells that were found on the site. There are pottery clues written, and in particular, writing exercises that were found. So clearly, there is writing activity on the site.
The archaeologists also discovered a large rectangular room that Father de Vaux interpreted as a refectory, where community meals were taken, and several baths used by the Jews to purify themselves.
Father de Vaux will interpret the ensemble discovered at Qumran as a kind of Essene monastery, a place of community life, where the Jews of a very particular sect, called the Essene, gathered in the desert to live in religious purity, and where they worked on the Jewish scriptures.
For Father de Vaux and his team, there is therefore no doubt Essenes would have lived on the site of Qumran, where they would have copied the manuscripts discovered in the caves. But after all that, would they be the authors of all the Dead Sea manuscripts, and would they have written part of the Old Testament texts?
In the end, the strongest link between the manuscripts and the site is a kind of label on the jars, since at the time on jars and containers, they would mark them by what it contained or the name of the owner. And in general, the inscriptions on jars are big letters that you can easily read from afar, which were written by the people who can read and write a little, but not very, very well. But here we have a jar which is inscribed with a beautiful plume by a professional scribe with a very small, very sophisticated handwriting. We thought that this is perhaps the most obvious piece of evidence, even if paradoxically it is the smallest, which can prove that indeed on this spot, among the occupants of the village, lived professional scribes capable of copying manuscripts.
The only certainty, therefore, would be that a certain number of manuscripts would have been copied on the spot, probably by the Essenes. But who wrote the other manuscripts? And why did they put them in the caves? The excavations made it possible to dissociate two types of caves. Natural caves far from the site, in which they found traces of troglodyte dwellings, and other artificial ones dug by human hands below the site of Qumran.
This makes us think of a sort of basement, a cellar, that you're going to dig below your home, in which you have fitted out. The walls are smoothed out. The manuscripts were obviously arranged according to a certain organization. It gives the impression of a library or archives which one can consult if one needs to. We must therefore be careful. For me, we have to distinguish between manuscripts that were certainly placed there over a long period of time. It was very carefully thought out and well organized. And on the other hand, manuscripts which were perhaps hastily placed in natural caves quite far from this site, and which were not intended for consultation because they were sealed in jars. So consulting these sealed manuscripts quickly when needed was out of the question.
Some caves would therefore have served as libraries, others as hiding places. But who could have concealed these manuscripts, and why? Do they correspond to different editors? The dating of the scrolls will offer researchers an element of the answer.
The manuscripts in these caves do not all date from the same period. We have manuscripts dating from the 3rd century BC, others from the 1st century. So these are copies that span several centuries.
I also think the manuscripts were not placed in the caves at the same time. Some were placed at an earlier time, and this is the case with the artificial caves under the site, while the manuscripts found in the natural caves are later. Maybe the famous war between the Jews and the Romans played a part in all of this.
It's 70 AD. The Romans besiege Jerusalem. The city is looted, set on fire, and the temple of the Jews is destroyed. Only the western wall will remain. It is known today as the Wailing Wall.
The people were running away from the Romans who were about to destroy Jerusalem and the country on the whole. And therefore, these people took the most precious belongings and they hid them in these caves.
Hoping to get them back after the war, but unfortunately they were never able to.
It is thus perhaps at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans that certain manuscripts of the Dead Sea would have been hidden in the caves by scribes who would have fled the besieged city. But were they then the first authors of the Bible? Researchers are turning towards the latest scientific methods to try to validate their theories. This time, it is no longer the texts that interest scientists, but the parchments themselves. Through chemistry or DNA testing, they hope to discover the exact provenance of these manuscripts.
A number of parchment manuscripts were chemically tested, which were used to copy the Dead Sea Scrolls. At least 3 different ways, 3 processes, 3 different techniques for preparing animal skins have been identified, because it's quite a process. We take an animal, we kill it, we're going to skin it, we are going to soak the skin in baths, and so there are different ways, different recipes for this. Sedimentary deposits on the very surface of these parchments were also analyzed. We realized that the sedimentary deposits were not always the same. Of course, those from the Dead Sea have, for example, mineral salts characteristic of the Dead Sea, but this is not the case for all. And so we realized that some of the manuscripts must have been brought there at a later time, perhaps even when they were already swaddled or already sealed, and therefore without having to endure the climatic conditions of the Dead Sea.
Thanks to this study, scientists have confirmed that some manuscripts did not come from Qumran. And that's not all. For the first time, researchers were able to perform a DNA study on a small sample of manuscripts.
They were able to extract DNA from the parchment. This was done on a very, very small sample of about 30 scrolls, and so it's just the first step towards a much broader analysis because DNA is about clustering, and if we only have 30 samples, it's much more difficult to cluster. But a few of the first steps taken already in this study show, for example, the types of animals being used in order to prepare the parchments. which is of interest because this is one of the debates. What were they using? Were they using sheep? Were they using goat?
Where we thought it was goat skin, it's more often sheep skin. You ask, what's the difference? Goats and sheep are the same, except in Qumran, by the Dead Sea, there are no sheep. It's a desert climate. But there are goats that can graze the grass that grows around. Flocks of sheep are found up in the mountains near Jerusalem. This means that the manuscripts, or in any case the skin that was used to copy the manuscripts, was not produced locally.
And this is not the only interest of this DNA study. Researchers have found that it could allow them to identify certain scribes.
DNA makes it possible to identify one animal from another. And so we tested 3 fragments. The researchers argued, asking, are these 3 fragments from the same manuscript? Were they copied by the same scribe? Or are they 3 fragments from 3 different manuscripts? In my opinion, 2 fragments do belong to the same manuscript because it is the same hand, the same writing, the same scribe. On the other hand, the 3rd fragment belongs to another manuscript. Thanks to DNA testing, we could test this hypothesis. And the tests show that the 2 fragments that I brought together do indeed belong to the same animal, while the 3rd fragment belongs to another animal.
Scientists are now sure that the Dead Sea Scrolls would have been copied and recopied for more than 300 years by several generations of scribes. Whether they were Essenes living in Qumran or religious scholars from Jerusalem. Who were these scribes? How many were there? Were they simple copyists or real authors? And what texts inspired them? To answer these new questions, we have to dive into the texts and fill in the gaps. It is once again thanks to science that researchers are trying to find the answers. In the Israeli Antiquities Authority laboratory, the most innovative techniques are called upon to make sense of fragments in very poor condition. Starting with a revolutionary technology developed by NASA for space telescopes, multispectral imagery.
It was suggested to us to do multispectral imaging. Multispectral imaging was actually developed for space science. One of the physicists who developed this, Greg Berman, he became our consultant. And this is how our digitization project began.
Using multispectral imagery, we can find the right wavelength that will allow the parchment or papyrus to reflect light, therefore to appear as light as possible, ideally all white. And the ink, on the contrary, will absorb the light and remain very black. This means we will have a maximum contrast.
To obtain this contrast, each image is taken at a different wavelength, calculated in nanometers.
So we start with 445 nanometer, and you can see now the light is working from both sides together, which means that we are gathering information, but it's very flat. So we gradually go up. This is 499, 540, 595, 638, 656, 700 nanometer. 700 nanometer is already the beginning of the near-infrared area, which emphasizes the text particularly because the text is carbon-based, the ink is carbon-based, so it emphasizes the text, and you can see the organic material, the parchment itself, is becoming more bright, and the text is coming out. And up. And this is the highest we are getting, 924 nanometer, and you can see the text is really clear.
The result is spectacular. No letter seems to be able to escape this extremely powerful scanner.
We're all going through more and more small fragments which were considered by the early scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls as unimportant because they were very, very small and fragmentary, and we're going through all these little small fragments and figuring out that sometimes they are without text, but a lot of the times they do have text, and sometimes that text can affect the way in which we interpret the larger scroll. So there may be a very, very large fragment which is affected by a very, very tiny fragment which connects to it.
It allows us to identify fragments, to verify the text of the Bible as it was copied on these fragments, to see the difference compared to the biblical texts that we know from the Middle Ages, and so to better document the history of the text of the Bible.
Using multispectral imagery on the Dead Sea Scrolls, researchers have found corrections, letters, and even words that do not exist in the biblical texts we know today. Little by little, the figure of the copyist becomes clearer. Unlike that of the Middle Ages, that of antiquity seems to have played a more important role in the writing and editing of biblical texts.
A bet, a cuff, a syntactic difficulty. Nothing escapes the scribes of antiquity. And when they change even a detail, it is never innocent. I therefore want to stress that there is a real concern for the exact letter in its smallest detail, because this conditions the message. So there is a close connection between the importance of the message and the importance of the letter. And so it's quite clear that the scribes of antiquity had an extremely precise concern for the smallest details of the text.
Scribes are scholars. They are intellectuals. They have a real job as a text editor. This is proofreading. This is a job which aims to improve the text to perfection. So each copy must be unique, because each copy must be better than the last.
Some researchers go even further. For them, there would not be an original text of the Bible, but several. As one becomes engaged in a careful reading of the text, many contradictions emerge.
For example, we have two stories of creation which are attached to each other. We have a first story in 7 days where man is created in the image of God, and immediately afterwards we are told the earth was deserted and empty and there was no man to cultivate the land. Whereas previously we were told that God created man. And we have the second story that we also know in the collective unconscious, where God takes earth and shapes man and breathes life into his nostrils. These are two contradictory accounts, so we can see that we have two traditions that have been stuck together.
In the same vein, how long did the flood last? 40 days, 150 days in the same story? So it creates contradictions. How many animals does Noah take in the ark? Some texts say a pair of each species, and then afterwards it says, no, for the clean animals, you have to take 7 pairs.
And we realize that Noah enters the ark twice. We realize that Noah closes the door twice. We realize that in one story it rains for 7 days. In another story it rains for 40 days. So we have two stories that have been nested into each other, two different traditions, and the authors made it into one story. And yet, if we look in detail, we can see these two stories very well. We manage very well to dissociate them and to make two independent accounts of them which date from two different periods, from two different schools, from two different religious traditions, from two different cultures.
And that is not all. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, researchers have discovered several copies of one of the most important collections of Old Testament prophecy, called the Book of Jeremiah.
When we examine each of these manuscripts, we realize that the text is quite different. Not just the placement of a comma, but there are whole chapters that are present or missing. There's even one manuscript on which a full half-page has been added in the margin, so we wonder what is happening. How could they move, add, remove entire pages of a book of the Bible? Today we would cry sacrilege. More importantly, this Dead Sea Scroll is one of the oldest, probably written in the 3rd century BC, meaning at a time when the book of Jeremiah is being written, rewritten, and edited. For me, it's very clear. What we see is the editorial activity itself. It's the editor's job, who says to himself here in the text, I'm going to add a new chapter, and that for the first time we can see it being done before our very eyes when looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And thus, the scribe would not only be an editor of the biblical text, but also an author.
For me, the Qumran discovery brings precisely this notion of the plurality of the texts. That is to say, the idea that we do not have a single text. We do not have an absolute text. I think what Qumran also changes is our perception of the work of the scribes, the capacity that the scribes have to intervene on the text, this ability and this idea that ultimately the scribe is also an author.
The text of the Bible would therefore not have been written by a single author or in a single stroke, but by many scribes who succeeded one another over more than 1,000 years, which is why we find several versions of the same story, but told differently.
We do not have someone who said to himself, I'm going to write Genesis, and who began with the first verse, Bereshit bara Elohim, who started to write and finished at the end of Genesis with a period saying, that's it, I'm done now, I wrote the Genesis. This situation does not exist in antiquity. We collected traditions, put them together, assembled them, and then other authors came after and copied these texts, added elements, adapted them to the cultural, historical, political, religious situation of their time. And so these texts gradually grew by successive layers.
It would therefore be in the scribes that we should seek, if not the authors, at least the writers of the biblical texts, the hands that wrote the Bible. Who were they? How many were there? This time, artificial intelligence is called upon to try to answer these questions. At the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, David Heminovich, French researcher and historian specializing in the Bible, is working on a brand new mathematical tool that he is in the process of developing, and which he calls the algorithm of God. He tries to identify the hands that wrote the Bible according to their graphology.
It's almost impossible to detect the hand of the scribes with the naked eye. For proof, in the Dead Sea manuscripts, the Qumran manuscripts, the hypothesis which prevailed until recently was to say almost that we have as many scribes as we have manuscripts, roughly 1,000. Except that in antiquity, it is never written that there are 1,000 scribes in the same place, the same time, copying things. So our gamble, so to speak, is to find common points in the writing, in the graphology of each letter, what is called paleography, so we can identify the hand of a single scribe.
For this, it uses the calculating power of the latest computers and an artificial intelligence technique called deep learning.
We teach the machine to think like a man, but in an augmented way, in a much faster way. The machine will calculate in about 10 minutes, which is relatively fast, the probability whether it is the same scribe's hand or not, and the computer, thanks to an algorithm, will learn to recognize a handwriting and see another hand is not the same, and therefore it learns by experience, which is related to the exercises we ask it to do. The more we advance in our research, the more our algorithm is perfected, and the more precise the computer becomes in running the algorithm.
Several months after training the computer, researchers discover the very first results of their experiment with this manuscript of Qumran, the Rule of the Community, which contains several corrections. Scientists are trying to find out if they were written by the same scribe as the main text.
As you can see, there are also additions, not just over the line, but also on the line.
If you look here, you see he scratched the text and added text above.
Like someone's correcting it.
Yes, like someone is correcting.
With the naked eye, it is impossible to determine if it was the same scribe who wrote the manuscript and corrected it, but not for the computer. This document shows all the calculation steps of the algorithm. But what interests researchers is the percentage at the very bottom of the document. If it approaches 50%, it is the same scribe. But if it gets closer to 100%, on the other hand, they are two different scribes. In this case, depending on the type of correction, the computer gives two opposite results. One close to 50%, the other close to 100%, which means that two different scribes would have corrected this text.
That's great, because you've solved the problem we had. Meaning, when it's corrected in the text you showed earlier, there are two different scribes. And the additions above the line are done by the same scribe? That's great. Bravo, Dario.
According to the algorithm, the corrections above the text would have been written by the same scribe as the main text, while the correction in the spaces would have been written by a different scribe.
This is great. Thanks to this, we have new arguments to say yes or no. Yes for a certain part of the text and no for another. So the new questions we may tackle are, why is there another scribe who felt the need to add or correct a piece of the text? Does it mean that it was studied a few years later? It can even be a few days later by another scribe who didn't agree and who says, I'll add my touch or clarify this text, maybe calling into question what was written before.
Thanks to this discovery, today, researchers hope that one day they will be able to count the number of hands that would have worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the meantime, other questions remain unanswered. What place did the scribes occupy in ancient society? How were they trained, and by whom? Where did they get this knowledge from? Once again, it is by turning to the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls that researchers have found some answers. One manuscript in particular, called the Book of Enoch, offers scientists key information about the social role of the scribe in antiquity.
In the Book of Enoch, Enoch is considered to be a scribe. Ultimately, the scribe is the one who has the special knowledge. In a way, scribe is the supreme title, scribe of justice, scribe of wisdom. It's the highest title that can be attributed to Patriarch Enoch.
In ancient times, the scribes were not only writing technicians, but they had a certain amount of social power, because they knew how to write, and religious power, especially in the Jewish world, where the scriptures are so important.
For me, the scribes are the political and religious intelligentsia in Middle Eastern society. They are writers, and therefore they have both the role of transmitting knowledge, and they are the holders of knowledge as well. Since they can read, they transmit, they teach. So they are not only the holders, but also the creators of this knowledge.
But there is one question that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not answer. These Bible stories that the scribes copy and modify over the centuries, where did they come from? What stories and other legends inspired them? And is there a sponsor who commissioned them? This time, studying the very content of the great biblical stories, researchers discovered similarities with ancient traditions borrowed from other cultures of the Near and Middle East.
We are in stories, for example, of creation or the stories of the flood, which are composed on myths extracted from Mesopotamia, and they are rewritten and reinterpreted. We have texts that can be read completely disconnected from religious contexts. They import external traditions into these texts, such as Mesopotamian or Egyptian traditions. Basically, the religious institutions are posterior. They are the proofreaders of those traditions.
The flood exists in several versions in Mesopotamian texts. They certainly heard of these stories and adapted it in their own way. The Exodus is a very complex story. We think no single scribe just wrote this for fun. Often the stories come from oral traditions. But what is complicated is that oral traditions aren't stable, they're constantly in flux. So the basis is undoubtedly oral. But the written version is undoubtedly an interpretation of this oral tradition. This compilation process did not happen all at once. Rather, it's an accumulation, an ongoing process where you start with oral traditions that are written down, that flow differently, separately from each other, that were put together at one point, partially, and then a little more, and then a little more. And this process, in my opinion, continues until the start of our era. In other words, in a way, the Bible was written over 1,000 years, and not just over 50 or 100 years, as we often hear.
So who, at some point in history, decided to bring these traditions together, to compile them in writing into the book of the Bible that we know today? And for what purpose? The answer may lie in stone. In Israel, 56 miles north of Jerusalem, Megiddo is one of the richest and largest archaeological sites in Israel and the Levant for the period in which the Old Testament is believed to have been written, between 3000 and 600 BC. Archaeologist Israel Finkelstein has co-directed excavation campaigns at Megiddo for almost 20 years.
The site represents the entire history of this country in the Bronze Age and in the Iron Age. So it's like opening a window into history. We have remains of a monumental structure. It dates to around 3000 BC. And then we go up and up with the layers, and the blocks that you see under the palm trees, they date to the 8th century BC. So what you get here is basically a history of 2,500 years or so, packed together in this stratigraphy of the site. So excavating here is really wonderful because you touch on all the sensitive points of the past of this region.
This site is known in the Bible as Armageddon, the site of the final battle between good and evil in the apocalypse. It would be inspired by a real event that took place in Megiddo in the 7th century BC. The death of King Josiah, slain by an Egyptian pharaoh, a defeat which would have represented a sort of end of the world for the Hebrews.
Josiah, king of Judah, he's described in the Bible as the most righteous of all monarchs of the Davidic dynasty, the best of them all, and they even compare him to Moses. They do not do this to any figure in the Bible.
According to Israel Finkelstein, it is this celebrated great King Josiah who would perhaps be the sponsor of a large part of the text of the Bible. A century before his reign, the Hebrews were divided into two kingdoms. To the north, Israel with Samaria as its capital. To the south, Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem. Josiah, king of the south, wants to reclaim the north and unify his people into one kingdom. To prepare for this conquest, he needs a story. His scribes would then have gathered legends, stories to make a formidable propaganda document in the service of their king. The first premises of the Bible. a text, therefore, which would have originally been a political project.
This is the moment of the great hopes in Judah of re-establishing the great united monarchy, which means the great two kingdoms together. It's an historical reconstruction. It's ideology, of course. So they manipulated the traditions of the North in order to reuse them for their own sake.
So we write them, because some texts were not written. The first verse of Deuteronomy is written at that time. We may take certain texts, such as the story of the Exodus, which comes from the north, and re-edit it. So it is indeed a kind of library to the glory of King Josiah, a small propaganda library, one could say.
The central idea of what will become the Bible would therefore have arisen during the reign of Josiah in the 7th century BC. But the death of the king, the destruction of his capital, and the exile of his people in Babylon did not keep this project from continuing.
One could have expected that with the destruction of Jerusalem, everything was lost. And the beauty of the thing and the miracle is that scribes, authors, continue to compose biblical texts after the destruction of Jerusalem with the changes which were important in order to understand what happens.
The strength of the Old Testament is therefore to have gathered stories to found the cultural and religious identity of a people in perpetual exile. The scribes continued to enrich and modify this text until it was set once and for all.
The milieu of the rabbis, which is one that will give birth to Judaism as we know it today, will probably fix the text around the 2nd century of our era. We know it because when we look at the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls of the 2nd century, the text is practically the same down to the comma. So we think the text is fixed, and besides, it will not move for 1,000 years. Since when we look at medieval rabbinical Bibles, they have the same text that is still read today in the synagogue.
Thanks to patient study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most recent scientific research, and archaeological excavations, researchers can now provide some answers to the great question of the authors of the Bible.
We can't say, Joe wrote the Bible. It wasn't like that. Joe took texts of A, B, C, D, and E, and F, and he basically took bits and pieces, and he put them together, edited them, made changes so that the text would maybe flow in a certain way.
Who wrote the Bible? The scribes are the key to the riddle. They are the ones who transmitted the Bible text century after century. They are the ones who brought this text to life, who improved it, who made it travel, who adapted it, who gave it the form which we know today, or actually the different forms which have come down to us.
As we close the Book of Books, we know a little bit more about its authors and the origins of its writing. But it retains an element of mystery, and perhaps that is what makes the Bible the greatest bestseller in history.